A human skull rests inside a glass case in a small church in France. Above the brow there is a hole, round, deliberate, and still visible today. Tradition says an archangel put it there, with nothing but his own finger. The island connected to that skull is surrounded by tides that rise as fast as a galloping horse. Beneath the waves nearby, locals still tell of a whole forest swallowed by the sea in a single night. For over 1,000 years, invading armies tried to take that island. Not one of them succeeded. The man who carried that wound in his skull was Aubert, a bishop in 8th century Normandy. He was known for his wisdom, his generosity, and, by nearly every account, his stubbornness. Aubert did not think of himself as someone who would need convincing twice.
The island he eventually built on would become Mont Saint-Michel, one of the most visited monuments in France, second only to the Eiffel Tower, drawing close to 3 million visitors every year. And 7 centuries after Aubert's death, the very same archangel is said to have appeared again. This time to a 13-year-old peasant girl in Lorraine. Her name was Joan of Arc. Aubert was a man trusted to lead an entire diocese, a man other people turned to for answers. And yet, when heaven itself gave him an order, it took real pain, not gentle persuasion, before he was willing to obey. So what does it take to make a stubborn man listen? And what did the cost of his doubt end up building? This is Hidden Halos, stories the saints left behind. Long before anyone called it Mont Saint-Michel, the local people of Normandy simply called it Mont Tombe, the Mount of the Tomb. Some say it carried the name because the rock itself looked like a burial mound rising out of the water. Others say it was because of what stood on its summit, an old Celtic burial ground, a place already set aside for the dead centuries before any church was built there. The bay around it was, and still is, one of the strangest stretches of water in Europe. At low tide, the sea pulls back for miles, leaving behind flat gray sand that looks solid enough to walk across. It is not. Beneath the surface, the sand shifts and softens without warning. A traveler who lingered too long, or strayed too far from the marked paths, could feel the ground give way beneath his feet, first at the ankles, then the knees, with no way to pull free before the water returned. And the water always returned. When the tide came in, it did not creep. It arrived at speeds early chroniclers compared to a galloping horse, rising as much as 46 feet in a matter of hours, closing over the flats and cutting the rock off completely from the mainland. Local memory holds an even older story, that somewhere beneath those waves lies a forest that once stood on dry land, swallowed, tradition says, in a single catastrophic flood, its bells said to still be heard tolling under the water on quiet nights. It is a story no document can confirm, but it is a story people have told for well over 1,000 years, and it says something about how this bay was regarded, long before anyone thought to build on it. This, then, was the place. An island that was not always an island, surrounded by sand that could swallow a man whole, crowned by a graveyard, and circled by water that moved like something alive. The people who lived near it did not think of it as a place to build. They thought of it as a place to be careful of. About 20 miles inland, in the town of Avranches, there lived a bishop the people trusted. He was known for his learning, his generosity to the poor, and a steady, careful temperament that had served his diocese well for years. His name was Aubert. He had no reason to think, on any ordinary night in the year 708, that his life, or that lonely, dangerous rock in the bay, was about to change forever. According to the earliest surviving account of what happened, a manuscript written by an anonymous monk roughly a century later, drawing on oral tradition already old by then, the vision came to Aubert in his sleep. He saw a figure of overwhelming light. The figure told him plainly and without ceremony to go to that dangerous rock in the bay and build a shrine there, in honor of the Archangel Michael. Aubert woke, and he did nothing. This is worth sitting with for a moment because it says something about the kind of man he was.
Aubert was not a fool, and he was not careless with his faith. He was a bishop who had spent years learning to be cautious about visions. Cautious because the church itself had always warned that not every voice in the night comes from God. He had almost certainly read the words later echoed in Scripture, "Test the spirits, to see whether they are from God."
A dream that told him to build a church on a lethal stretch of quicksand, watched over by a graveyard, was, by any reasonable measure, a dream worth questioning. So Aubert questioned it. According to the tradition, he told himself he had simply eaten too richly the night before. Too much cheese, too much shellfish from the coast, and that his mind had produced nothing more than an ordinary dream born of an ordinary supper. It was, in its way, the most sensible explanation available to him. He returned to his duties. He said nothing to anyone. Days passed, then weeks. The rock in the bay remained exactly as it had always been, empty, tide-locked, marked only by the old graves at its summit. If this had been the end of it, no one would remember Aubert's name today. He would have lived out an ordinary episcopate in an ordinary Norman town, and Montombe would have remained what it had always been, a dangerous rock that people avoided, and nothing more. But according to the same account, the vision did not let the matter rest. It came again. The second vision, according to the tradition, was not gentler than the first. If anything, it was more insistent. The same figure of light returned to Aubert and repeated the command, "Build the shrine, on the rock, in honor of Michael," this time leaving no room for the excuse of rich food or a restless stomach. Aubert woke a second time, and, according to the account, he still did not obey. This is the point in the story where it becomes tempting to judge him, to see a man ignoring heaven twice and assume he was simply willful, or proud, or slow of faith. But the tradition itself offers a more complicated reason, and it is worth taking seriously, because it is more human than the simple version. Aubert's hesitation this second time was not about doubting that something supernatural had spoken to him. It was about doubting what kind of thing it was. The church he served had always taught that not every vision, not every voice, not every figure of light in the night was to be trusted blindly. Some, tradition warned, could deceive. Aubert was not only weighing whether to believe in a miracle, he was weighing whether the miracle in front of him was the true kind at all, or something wearing its likeness. It is a strange kind of faith that hesitates out of caution rather than indifference. And it is, in its way, a more relatable kind. Few people who have felt certain that God was asking something difficult of them have obeyed instantly, without a moment's doubt about whether they had heard correctly. Aubert's second refusal was not the refusal of a stubborn man ignoring an obvious truth. It was the refusal of a careful man, unwilling to reshape his diocese and risk his own soul, on the strength of a dream he could not yet be certain of. But caution has a cost. While Aubert weighed and waited, the rock in the bay remained untouched. The tides kept rising and falling at their terrible pace. The old graves at the summit stayed exactly as they were, watched by no one, tended by no one. And somewhere beyond Aubert's understanding, according to the tradition, his patience, divine or otherwise, was beginning to run out. A third night was coming. And this time there would be no room left for doubt, no gentle repetition, no dream easily explained away by supper the night before. What came next would leave a mark Aubert would carry for the rest of his life. One that, according to legend, can still be seen today, 800 years after his death, in a glass case in a French church. According to the account, the third vision did not come as gently as the first two had. Aubert was asleep when he felt it, a pressure against his forehead, sharp and deliberate, as if a single finger were being pressed hard into the bone beneath his skin. He woke to pain, real physical pain, not the vague unease of a dream fading at the edge of memory, but something his body had felt and would go on feeling. The tradition says the figure of light stood over him one final time, and that whatever patience had governed the first two visits was gone. There would be no third dream to sleep through and dismiss over breakfast. This time, Aubert was left with proof he could touch. When he raised his hand to his own head, he found a wound,
a hole, small and precise above his brow. The kind of mark no ordinary sleep produces, no accident explains. We cannot know exactly what passed through Aubert's mind in the hours that followed. No letter of his survives. No diary records his private thoughts because none was ever written. Bishops of 8th century Normandy left instructions and land grants, not confessions. But we do know what he did next, and it tells us something the missing words cannot. He stopped waiting. According to the tradition, Aubert gathered workers and set out for the rock in the bay, the same dangerous stretch of quicksand and racing tide that he had, twice before, judged too unreasonable a place to build on. This time, he did not turn back. He is said to have overseen the clearing of the summit himself, seated on a stone as the first foundations were laid, refusing to leave the site until the work was underway. A small oratory rose on the rock, modest by later standards, nothing like the towering abbey that would eventually replace it. It was dedicated to the Archangel Michael on the 16th of October, in the year 709. For the first time in longer than anyone could remember, the graveyard on the summit of Mont Saint-Michel had a building beside it, and a bell, and a reason for the living to climb up and stay a while. Aubert did not live to see what that small building would become. He died around the year 720, and, according to the same tradition that recorded his visions, was buried at the site he had finally agreed to build. For centuries afterward, pilgrims who came to the growing abbey were shown one particular relic above all others: the skull of the bishop who founded it, still bearing the mark where, tradition insisted, an archangel's finger had once pressed through the bone. It is worth pausing here, honestly, on what can and cannot be verified. The written account of these three visions was not set down by Aubert himself, and not even by someone who witnessed them. It was recorded roughly 100 years later, by an anonymous monk drawing on oral memory already old by his own time. That does not make the story worthless. Oral tradition, especially around a founding event still marked by a standing building, can carry real information forward. But it does mean this is not a modern, medically documented account like the ones later Hidden Halos episodes have drawn on. It is something older and stranger. A story a community told about itself, attached, improbably, to a physical object still on display today. Because the skull did not disappear along with the century that produced it. It survived war, revolution, and the collapse of the very abbey it had inspired. And what happened to it next says as much about human devotion as anything that happened to Aubert while he was alive. For nearly 1100 years, the story of Aubert's wound survived the way most medieval memory did. Through relics, through pilgrimage, through the abbey's own retelling, generation after generation. But it came closest to vanishing entirely during a single decade at the end of the 18th century. In 1791, the French Revolution closed the abbey. Its monks were driven out. Religious relics across the country were being seized, scattered, or destroyed as symbols of the old order the revolution meant to erase. Aubert's skull, kept for centuries at the church nearest the abbey, was, by most accounts, in real danger of being lost along with everything else. According to local record, it survived because one man intervened. A physician in the region is said to have taken the skull under the pretext of medical study, keeping it safely out of reach until the worst of the upheaval had passed. It is a smaller, quieter kind of survival story than the vision itself. No archangel, no fire, just one ordinary man deciding a fragment of the past was worth protecting. In 1856, the relic was formally transferred to its current home, the Basilica of Saint-Gervais-Saint in Avranches, where it remains on display to this day. And it is here that the story becomes, in an honest sense, more complicated. Modern examination of the skull has raised a serious alternative explanation for the hole above its brow. Some researchers who have studied it believe the perforation shows signs consistent with trepanation, an ancient surgical or ritual practice predating Aubert by centuries, in which a hole was deliberately cut into the skull, sometimes as treatment, sometimes for reasons no longer understood. Under this reading, the relic, long venerated as proof of an archangel's touch, may in fact be a far older object entirely, one whose true origin has nothing to do with Aubert at all. Hidden Halos will not pretend this question is settled, because it is not. What can be said plainly is this: the physical object is real, it exists. It has been displayed, prayed over, and puzzled over for well over 800 years, by people who believed it was Aubert's and by scientists who have suggested it may not be. Both of those things can be true about an object at once: that it carries genuine, centuries-old religious meaning for the people who venerate it, and that its scientific origin remains an open question. What is not in dispute is what came next. What rose out of that dangerous quicksand-ringed rock once a small oratory had finally been built on it. Because Aubert's modest wooden and stone chapel did not stay modest for long.
Within 3 centuries, an idea would take hold on that summit that most builders of the time would have called impossible. To raise a full cathedral, not beside the peak, but directly on top of it. By the year 966, the small oratory Aubert had built 2.5 centuries earlier was no longer enough. Richard I, Duke of Normandy, brought a community of Benedictine monks to the island, replacing the handful of canons who had kept watch there since Aubert's time. It was the moment the site stopped being a modest shrine and became something else entirely, an abbey, with ambition to match. That ambition reached its most audacious point in 1023, when Duke Richard II commissioned an Italian architect named William of Volpiano to design a new church for the summit. Volpiano had already built one of the great Romanesque abbeys of his age at Fécamp, but Mont Saint-Michel, as the island was now known, presented him with a problem no ordinary building site could match. The summit of the rock was barely wide enough to stand a small church on, let alone a cathedral. Most architects of the era would have built lower, on more solid ground, and left the peak for something smaller. Volpiano did not. He made a decision that modern archaeologists still study with something close to disbelief. He placed the crossing of the new church, the very center point, where nave meets transept, directly on the summit's narrow tip. It should not have worked. The rock at the peak could not bear that kind of weight on its own. So Volpiano's solution was to build downward before he built upward, carving out a series of crypts beneath the planned church floor, hollow chambers of stone that would absorb and redistribute the weight of everything above them. Centuries later, researchers working with the French National Scientific Research Institute would confirm just how deliberate this engineering had been. As one archaeologist on the project put it, describing the substructure beneath the church, 3 crypts were built around the summit to provide, along with Notre-Dame sous terre, the foundation needed to erect the abbey church above them. Notre-Dame sous terre, the underground Our Lady, was in fact the oldest surviving piece of the whole complex. The very first stone church Aubert's successors had built on the site in the 10th century, now buried and repurposed as one of the crypts holding up everything built afterward. Nothing here was wasted. Every earlier failure, every earlier limitation of the rock was folded into the foundation of what came next. It did not always hold. In 1421, during a later stage of construction, part of the church's choir collapsed, taking a section of its supporting crypt down with it. As one CNRS researcher recorded, in 1421, the choir of the Roman Church collapsed, and with it, a part of its supporting crypt. The monks rebuilt it, this time in the soaring, light-filled, flamboyant Gothic style just coming into fashion, a striking contrast to the older, heavier Romanesque stonework beneath it. Over 6 centuries, in layer after layer, the abbey grew this way. Romanesque nave beside Gothic choir, ancient crypt beneath modern spire, each generation of monks and architects building not around the failures of the past, but directly on top of them. By the 13th century, the northern side of the abbey had gained a name of its own, La Merveille, the Marvel, a 3-story Gothic wonder of vaulted halls and cloisters, some of its rooms cantilevered out over the cliff edge itself, as if daring the rock below to give way.
It never did. What stands on that summit today, towers, spire, and all, rises to nearly 300 feet above the bay, an almost impossible weight of stone balanced on a foundation of hollow crypts and stubborn medieval will. Visitors climbing toward it now rarely think about what lies beneath their feet. Chamber after chamber of buried, unglamorous stonework, doing the quiet work of holding up a miracle no one was ever quite sure should have been attempted in the first place. But an abbey built to honor an archangel of war was, before long, going to be tested by something more literal than architecture. Within 400 years, armies would come for this rock, not out of curiosity, but out of conquest. And the same tides that had once threatened to swallow careless travelers whole would become, for one embattled kingdom, its last and most unlikely line of defense. By the early 15th century, France and England had been locked in what would later be called the 100 Years' War for nearly a century, and for long stretches of it, France was losing badly. English forces held large portions of the country. French morale, in many regions, was running thin. Mont Saint-Michel sat squarely in England's path, a fortified abbey on French-held ground, its walls thickened over centuries of construction, its monks and small garrison holding a position no ordinary siege tactics could easily reach. In February of 1423, English forces seized the small island of Tomblain, just off the coast, and used it as a staging ground to move against the Mont itself. What followed was not a quick victory for either side. The siege dragged on through 1424, and the English were forced to withdraw without taking the abbey. A decade later, they tried again. This time under the command of Thomas de Scales, 7th Baron Scales, leading, according to popular tradition of the time, a force of several thousand men. The assault in June of 1434 was, by contemporary accounts, a disaster for the attackers. As the tide came in, the same tide that had once been feared as a danger to careless pilgrims, it is said to have caught English soldiers in the open flats, drowning a number of them where they stood. Scales withdrew. He left behind 2 heavy iron bombards, too cumbersome to carry back across the tidal flats in retreat. The people of the region gave the abandoned cannons a name of their own, Les Michelettes, the Little Michaels, and set them near the outer gate, where, remarkably, they remain on display to this day, nearly 600 years later. Why did Mont Saint-Michel never fall, in an era when so much of France did? Military historians point to practical reasons. The abbey's thick fortified walls, its elevated position, and above all the bay's brutal, unpredictable tides, which made it nearly impossible for a besieging army to maintain a stable position long enough to break through. But the people living through the war at the time did not only see engineering and geography. They saw an abbey dedicated to the Archangel of the heavenly armies, standing untaken while so much of the country around it fell. To them, the Mont's survival was not simply lucky, it was protected. That belief, that this particular rock, and the figure it was dedicated to, stood guard over France in its darkest hour, did not stay confined to Normandy. Word of the Mont's endurance traveled, and roughly 2 years before that final failed siege of 1434, in a small village nearly 300 miles away, a young peasant girl was already telling people that the same archangel who was said to protect that fortress by the sea had begun speaking directly to her. Her name was Joan. She lived in a small farming village called Domremy-Domy in the region of Lorraine, in the household of a modest tenant farmer. In the summer of 1425, by some accounts 1424, she was 13 years old, standing in her father's garden, when something happened that she would spend the rest of her short life trying, and largely failing, to explain to the people who demanded she explain it. She heard a voice. It came, she would later say, with a blaze of light beside it, bright enough that she noticed it even in the middle of the day. At first it was simply a voice, close to her, as if someone were speaking directly into her ear. In time she came to recognize who was speaking. Years later, standing trial for her life, she would tell her judges plainly, "I saw them with these very eyes as well as I see you." The figure she named first, and returned to throughout her testimony, was the Archangel Michael. It is worth pausing on how remarkable this connection is, because it is not a connection hidden halos is drawing for dramatic effect. It is documented, independently, across multiple accounts of Joan's own testimony. According to trial records, she described her first encounter this way. "It was Saint Michael that I saw before my eyes, and he was not alone." Michael, in the tradition that grew up around Joan's account, is even said to have introduced himself to her directly. Michael, protector of France, before turning to the matter of what he wanted from her. Consider the timing. Joan's first encounter with Michael is generally placed in the summer of 1425, the same narrow window of years, historians have noted, in which Mont Saint-Michel was enduring its long, grinding standoff with English forces, and only months before Thomas de Scales would lead his final failed assault against the abbey walls. A peasant girl in Lorraine, who had almost certainly heard the stories traveling through the countryside about the fortress by the sea that would not fall, began hearing the voice of the very figure that fortress was dedicated to defending France under. Father Pierre Doadois, the current rector of the shrine at Mont Saint-Michel, has spoken about this connection directly. Joan of Arc's mission was made possible thanks to the support and assistance of Saint Michael, he has said. It was not, in his account, a single dramatic appearance and nothing more. Not only was Saint Michael present in the early stages, the voices she heard in Domremy, but also at the end of her life, in her final hours and trials. What Michael asked of Joan, according to her own testimony, unfolded gradually. The earliest messages were simple: to live a good life, to attend church faithfully, to conduct herself well. Over months and then years, the instructions grew more specific and far more difficult. To leave her village, to seek out the uncrowned King of France, and to help him reclaim a country that was, by then, largely under English control. She was 17 when she finally convinced anyone in authority to take her seriously. What followed, her role in lifting the siege of Orléans in 1429, her presence at the coronation of Charles VII, her capture, her trial, and her death at the stake in Rouen in 1431, is a story Hidden Halos has told before and will not retell in full here. But it is worth remembering, standing at this point in Aubert's story, that the figure Joan credited with guiding her through all of it was the same archangel who, 7 centuries earlier, had stood over a stubborn bishop's bed and refused to let him sleep through a warning twice. 2 very different people, 2 very different centuries. The same voice, insisting, in both cases, that ordinary, reluctant human beings had a part to play in something larger than themselves. Aubert had needed pain before he would listen. Joan, by most accounts, needed something closer to relentless patience. Years of a voice returning again and again, guiding her slowly toward a mission she did not choose and, by her own testimony, did not fully understand until she was living it. Both of them, in their own way, resisted first. Both of them, eventually, obeyed. By the winter of 1430, Joan was a prisoner. She had been captured outside Compiègne the previous May, sold to English Allied forces, and delivered to an ecclesiastical court in Rouen that had little interest in a fair hearing and every interest in a conviction. For months she was interrogated, repeatedly, exhaustingly, by trained theologians looking for any inconsistency they could use against her. Under that kind of pressure, in the spring of 1431, Joan did something she would later reverse. She signed a statement recanting her claims, including her testimony about the voices that had guided her for years. It is not hard to understand why. She was young, alone, facing men with far more legal training than she had, and facing, if she did not comply, the near certainty of being burned as a heretic. But according to the trial record and the Catholic tradition that grew around it, her recantation did not last. Accounts describe her in the days that followed, at the end of her strength. Uncertain, for perhaps the only recorded time in her ordeal, whether the voice she had followed for 6 years had truly been real at all. It was then, tradition holds, that Michael came to her one final time. Not in a garden this time, and not with the light and clarity of that first summer afternoon in Domremy, but in a prison cell, to a frightened 19-year-old who had every reason to believe she had lost everything already worth losing. Whatever passed between them in that cell, the effect was immediate and irreversible. Joan withdrew her recantation. She returned to the testimony she had given from the beginning, that the voices were real, that Michael and the others had truly spoken to her, knowing this time, with far less room for doubt, about what that testimony would cost her. Father Pierre Dot has described this moment as the completion of a pattern that ran through Joan's entire life. Michael present, not only in the early stages, but also at the end of her life, in her final hours and trials. The archangel who had first spoken to a child in a garden did not abandon the young woman she had grown into, even in a cell, even at the very end. Joan was condemned as a relapsed heretic and executed at Rouen in May of 1431. She was 19 years old. Nearly 25 years later, a second trial, convened at the request of her own mother, overturned the conviction entirely, declaring her innocent of the charges that had killed her. She was canonized in 1920, 500 years almost to the day after she first stood in her father's garden and heard a voice she did not yet have a name for. 2 obedient refusals, 7 centuries apart. Aubert had needed a wound in his skull before he would build what he was asked to build. Joan needed a voice returning to her, one final time, in the dark of a prison cell, before she would finish what she had already given her life to. Neither of them chose an easy path. Both of them, in the end, chose to walk it anyway. And on the rock in the bay that had started this entire story, the fortress Michael's insistence had finally forced into being, the centuries that followed Joan's death would not be kind to the Abbey Albert once refused, twice, to build. For nearly 400 years after Joan's death, Mont Saint-Michel continued largely as it had been, a working abbey, a pilgrimage site, a fortress that had earned a reputation no army seemed able to break. Kings of France made the journey there themselves, generation after generation, to honor the archangel who had, in the popular imagination at least, kept the rock standing while so much of the country had not. But reputation does not protect a building forever. By the 16th and 17th centuries, the religious movements reshaping Europe had drawn attention, and pilgrims, away from older shrines like this one. The abbey's population of monks shrank, year after year, from dozens to a handful. By the time the French Revolution reached Normandy at the very end of the 18th century, there were, by most accounts, scarcely any monks left in residence at all. In 1791, the revolutionary government closed the abbey outright. What happened to it next was, in its way, a harder fate than simple abandonment. The buildings that Aubert had begun and generations of monks had spent 8 centuries expanding were converted into a prison, one intended, in its first years, specifically to hold clergy who refused to accept the new revolutionary order. At its most crowded, the site held close to 300 priests within its walls. The people of the region gave it a bitter nickname, La Bastille des Mers, the Bastille of the Sea, after the infamous Parisian fortress prison whose storming 2 years earlier had helped ignite the revolution itself. It was not a flattering comparison for a building once dedicated to an archangel. It was, in its own dark way, an honest one. Life inside that prison was harsh by any account. Supplies for the prisoners had to be hauled up the same steep, winding paths pilgrims had once climbed in devotion. Except now the labor of lifting them fell to a massive wooden treadwheel, installed within the walls, which prisoners themselves were made to walk inside, turning it like animals in a cage, to raise goods and materials to the buildings above. That wheel still stands today, preserved, one of the more sobering exhibits inside a monument otherwise associated with light and pilgrimage. The prison endured for over 70 years, through the Revolution, through Napoleon's rule, through the restoration of the French monarchy and its collapse all over again. It was not closed until 1863, and only after public figures of the era, troubled by the decay of what had once been one of France's great religious monuments, began campaigning for its restoration. The recovery, once it began, was slow but steady. In 1874, the site was formally listed as a historic monument, and restoration work began in earnest, work that would continue, in one form or another, for well over a century. Nearly 100 years after the last monks had been driven out, in 1969, on the Abbey's own 1000th anniversary, a small religious community returned to live and pray within its walls once more. 10 years after that, in 1979, Mont Saint-Michel and its surrounding bay were formally inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, recognized, by an international body with no particular religious stake in the matter, as one of the most significant places of medieval Christian civilization anywhere on earth. Today, monks and nuns still live and pray at the Abbey, holding services 3 times a day, much as they have, with long interruptions, since the 10th century. The treadwheel that once ground beneath the feet of imprisoned priests now stands silent, viewed by visitors who often have no idea what it was built for. And somewhere below, in the crypts William of Vulpiano ordered dug nearly 1,000 years ago, the old foundations still hold. Quietly, unglamorously, everything built on top of them. The skull is still there. Inside its glass and gilt reliquary at the Basilica of Saint-Gervais, in a quiet town not far from the coast, the bones tradition has called Auberts for well over 1,000 years continue to draw visitors. Pilgrims, historians, the simply curious. Up close enough to see the hole above the brow for themselves. Some come believing it is exactly what generations before them believed. The mark of an archangel's finger pressed into a stubborn man's skull until he finally listened. Others come knowing the more skeptical explanation, that it may be a far older wound, a relic of ancient trepanation with nothing to do with Aubert at all. Both groups stand in front of the same glass case. Neither can fully prove the other wrong. And a short distance away, rising out of the bay exactly where a lonely graveyard once stood, the building that hole is said to have caused still stands too. No longer the small wooden oratory Aubert reluctantly agreed to build, but nearly 300 feet of stone, spire, and gilded statue, one of the most recognized silhouettes in all of France. Today, close to 3 million people make the journey to Mont Saint-Michel every year, more than visit almost any other monument in the country, second only to the Eiffel Tower itself. Most of them come for the view, for the tide, for a photograph they have seen 100 times before and finally want to take themselves. A smaller number climb all the way to the Abbey at the summit, where monks and nuns still hold services 3 times a day, in rooms built over crypts an Italian architect designed 1,000 years ago to hold weight that, by every reasonable measure, should never have been placed on that narrow peak in the first place. None of it. Not the Abbey, not the fortress that outlasted 100 years of war, not the small farming girl in Lorraine who heard the same voice Aubert once did, exists because a bishop found faith easy. It exists because a careful, reasonable man said no twice, was made to say yes a third time through real and lasting pain, and then spent whatever years he had left building something he had never wanted to build in the first place. How many warnings, in an ordinary life, arrive quietly enough to be mistaken for nothing at all? A strange dream, an uneasy feeling, a voice too easily explained away. And how many of them are given, as Aubert's was, a second chance, and even a third, before the moment for listening finally closes? If this story moved you, consider subscribing to Hidden Halos, new documentaries on the lives of the saints, released regularly. This is Hidden Halos, stories the saints left behind.